Well, greetings and welcome back to our study on becoming God's people. I'm really sorry about my voice today. I've been fighting something all week where that's just affecting my voice. Um, Today we're talking about Exodus 15, or we're looking at the background to Exodus 15, becoming God's people. Um, I know it is Easter week. It's Resurrection Sunday this Sunday, and this is coming out on Good Friday. But I wanted to keep with my plan to work all the way through the Pentateuch this year. Plus, I do think that this story does have some good crossover to the resurrection, and I try to draw that out in my reflection for the week, and you can find it in the link below. But for today, I want to talk about the background to Exodus 15. We left off last week in Exodus 12 with the Passover and the Israelites being told that they had to partake in the Passover meal in order to be counted as part of the people, and that they had to if they did not participate, they would have suffered at the hands of the angel of death, or whoever we want to say it was passing over, at the same way the Egyptians did. And we get this picture of the Israelites celebrating Passover, and as they do, this angel of death visits Pharaoh and Egypt, and the Pharaoh says to the people, calls in Moses against his previous conviction that Moses would never see his face. Pharaoh calls Moses in and tells the people to leave. So the people are now free. They can leave Egypt. But we notice the the disjunction between Pharaoh's character and the people of Egypt. Pharaoh is very angry. He lets the people go because he's forced to, not because he wants to, not because he's had a change of heart. It's just anger. But the people of Egypt give generously to the people of Israel before they leave. The people of Israel gain silver and gold. They're giving gifts as they leave. This is a sign of a sign that the Egyptians are favorable to Israel. They're not really doing this because they're scared. This is more of a sign of favor. When we get to it, we'll highlight it. Hopefully, in Israelite slave laws later, they are to give a departing slave a gift to start their own life. You're supposed to, after you've gotten the slave's work for 6 years, on top of that, you're supposed to give him a gift that is large enough that he can start a new life. So basically, you're supposed to give him wages, even the slaves, they cite this generosity from the Egyptians for the work of the Israelites as precedent for why Israelites are to give gifts to slaves when they leave service. So the Israelites leave, they pack up. We're given this detail that 600,000 men left Egypt. At least that's how most English Bibles render it. Rendering it that way, translating it that way, creates a problem. 600,000 men translates into about 2 million, a little over 2 million Israelites. That is an unwieldy number. It is almost impossible, actually, frankly, in some ways, it is impossible to think of 2 million people crossing the desert the way the Israelites did, and further, 2 million people crossing the desert and being, according to the text elsewhere, smaller than any of the peoples of Canaan, smaller than the 7 groups of Canaan. It's hard to believe that 2 million people would be the smallest group in the land of Canaan. It's also almost impossible to believe that 2 million people could stay together in the wilderness and find sufficient food and water, even with the miracles. But what makes it most improbable is that crossing the sea, the text says that the Israelites crossed in a night. Well, the problem is walking 50 abreast, not counting animals. The last Israelites would be getting to the edge of the sea at about the time when the water should have been collapsing back. It would have taken the Israelites far too long to cross that sea, even if you discount the animals. They would have had to have had a path something like 500 yards across in order to make it through in a timely fashion. It's just not feasible. So there's another way to translate this text, and that is to read the term thousand as a unit. This is legitimate. Elsewhere, we are given military units called thousands, and they are made up of about 20 individuals, or a little less. So, read that way, you're thinking about somewhere between 10 and 25,000 individuals left Egypt. That number is far more sustainable. That number is far easier to manage. It still reads well with the text, but it makes everything flow a whole lot better. It's still a large number, it's still a significant number, but it is not an unwieldy number. So that's what I choose to go with. I tend to think that there's about 10 to 25,000 people that the text is trying to represent. And we notice further that it's not simply Israelites who are leaving Egypt. There are other nationalities mixed in. There are Egyptians mixed in. From the start, Israel as a political unit, because Israel, once they cross the sea and they get up to the mountain where God meets them, they become this new group, this new political unit. Yeah. And from the start, there are other nations mixed in. This is not a pure ethnic group. There are other nationalities allowed in with Israel, and they seem to be given standing within the community. They are not slaves. They are not looked down on. They are equals within the community from the get-go. Now, that is as important as we read through that while this people is always talked about as one unit, one family, one nationality, and we tend to focus on that, there is a reality that from our vantage point, this would be multicultural. But this multicultural unit becomes a singular unit. It becomes one family. In other words, this multicultural group absorbs and becomes one, which is a great analogy for us. Anyway, they approach the sea. They are leaving Egypt. They approach the sea, and as they approach the sea, the Egyptians under Pharaoh gather chariots, and they are going to bring back Israel. Pharaoh has calmed down. He hasn't had a change of heart. He's calmed down. And once he's calmed down, his normal mind, his rational mind takes over. And he wants his power. He wants his slaves. So he he gets his chariots together and pursues Israel to the sea. Um, Again, this shows you the character of Pharaoh. When he's angry and agitated, that's when he does what we would consider the right thing. It's when he is in his right mind that he does what we would consider the evil. He is that unjust as an individual. He is that bent by sin that he is so twisted that when he shouldn't be in his right mind, that's when he acts like he's in his right mind. And when he is in his right mind, well, that's when he acts the way he shouldn't. God sees this, and God comes down between the peoples, the Israelites on one side and the Egyptians on the other, with a storm. We talk about fire and cloud, that's thunder and lightning. There's a huge storm. Obviously, that's going to prevent Egypt from pursuing Israel. But from the Egyptian point of view, that's no big deal. Storms are temporary. The sea is there. And the people are there because they're backed up against a boundary. All Egypt has to do is make sure that they don't move, say, north or south. Then the people are at the mercy of the Egyptians. But what the Egyptians don't know is God is opening up the sea on the other side. Now, this is not kind of the Charlton Heston depiction of the sea. This is not the middle of the Red Sea with 150-foot walls of water on either side. This is the passage says the Yom Suf. This is the Sea of Reeds. We don't know where it is. It is probably just a shallower body of water. This does not mean seas for us are large bodies of water. That's not necessarily what the text is telling us, but it is, a relatively decent barrier, because I don't know if you guys have ever tried to walk across water. It doesn't usually work, no matter how shallow it is, especially with a large group of people, with children and animals. Unless you have a ford, it's not something you're going to do. So God divides the water of the sea. And here we should recognize that the author is both telling us a historical detail and using language that is supposed to help us see more than just the history. God is here dividing the sea. This is to bring out dry land. This is creation language. This is language from Genesis 1. We are supposed to see that God is removing the chaos, removing the evil, removing the hardship, so that the people can cross. And once the people have crossed, everything returns. In other words, God is bringing the people into Eden. This is something that I talk about a little bit in the reflection, but it's worth noting here too, that the physical reality of the story is only half of the story. The language used is supposed to help us think about this in terms of creation and even the flood. This is the people crossing through chaos in order to enter or to really exit slavery to sin and to cross into God's land. Yet when injustice tries to cross, when Pharaoh's people try to cross, the sea closes up because the injustice is swallowed in the chaos. This is the story of the flood all over again, and we're supposed to see that repetition here. We also should point out that Pharaoh is not necessarily killed. It says that all who pursued the Israelites into the sea, they were drowned, But it doesn't necessarily say everybody. It doesn't. The text doesn't necessarily say that all of Pharaoh's people followed into the sea. Um, there's some ambiguous language, because I think on one hand the text wants to imply that Pharaoh is killed, because he is the head, he's the head of the serpent, so to speak, and to kill him off means they're killing off injustice. So there's an implication that he is killed. However, it doesn't explicitly say that, and it's probably a good thing, because it's hard to square that with the historical reality that the two pharaohs who are most often noted in connection with this event, neither of them, we have decent evidence for both of them, and it doesn't look like either of them were killed in battle, let alone drowned in the sea. At least not that I'm aware of. It's kind of hard to reconcile this. It's kind of hard to reconcile Pharaoh being killed with a historical event. But again, it's about the symbolism here too. So the author's playing both. And we should recognize that. We should recognize that the author is not simply giving us a historical picture. The author is giving us a symbolic picture laid on top of a historical picture to help us understand who God is and what God is doing for the people of Israel in helping them to leave and escape Egypt. So that brings us to the reflection. Oh, I should say there's one other thing. There's one thing I wanted to point out quickly. In Exodus 15:3, God is called a warrior. And I love how Nahum Sarna, the Jewish scholar, talks about this, because Sarna points out that God is only a warrior because Pharaoh came to battle. If Pharaoh wouldn't have come for battle, if Pharaoh wouldn't have come with chariots and a war machine, God would not be a warrior. If Pharaoh wouldn't have come, God would have just simply been a deliverer. In other words, the metaphors that we use for God reflect how we approach God. That is a very profound statement, that the metaphors we use for God are the metaphors that's how we approach God. That's what we see when we come to God. It is a wonderful thought for us to close on, because it forces us to say, what metaphors are my favorite for God? What are the ones that I like to use? Because they will impact how I see God and how God responds to me. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, if you have any questions or comments, you can get a hold of me easily. Please ask. I'd love to hear what you're discovering in this series, what you're learning, any questions that you have. And until we meet again, God bless.